As we come now to look at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, can I suggest that you take a few moments to look at the YouTube video clip, which no doubt again you're well familiar with. Again, a very helpful overview of these two books. So take a few moments to do that, and once you've watched that, continue on with this video presentation. We come now to look at the whole question of the authorship of Ezra and Nehemiah. And as you probably already picked up along the way, there has been a long-held tradition that Ezra and Nehemiah, in fact, was one singular volume. As of course we read Ezra chapter 1 and verse 1, and then we look at Nehemiah 1 and verse 1, we can be left with the impression that we've actually got two different authors. Nehemiah 1 verse 1 says the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. And yet for a long time there has been a general consensus that what we have here actually is the work of one singular author. Josephus, that first century historian, Jewish historian, and also even in the Jewish Talmud, referred to the book of Ezra not as a separate book to Nehemiah, but in fact just as one complete volume. The oldest manuscripts of the Septuagint, the old Greek translation of the Old Testament, also treats Ezra and Nehemiah as one book. In fact, going right back as far as Origen, one of the early church fathers and theologians, he was one of the first, though, to distinguish between the two books, but his distinction was simply like this. He basically suggested that they be called one Ezra and two Ezra. The Latin Vulgate, of course, which was produced by Jerome some century or so later, called Nehemiah the second book of Ezra or Ezra. And a similar notion is in one way reflected in the early English translations by Wycliffe and Cloverdale, who also called Ezra one Esdras and Nehemiah as two Esdras. But whichever way we look at it, there's clearly no doubt that there's been a strong sense of connection between the two, and this illusion, if nothing else, that the author is probably the same person. And in fact, these works are often referred to collectively as the memoirs of Ezra and Nehemiah. And what we find is that between the two books we have basically very similar material that is bouncing back and forth between the stories of Ezra's involvement and Nehemiah's involvement. But there are a number of striking similarities between the composition of the books. Both books seem to feature significantly lists. For example, in Ezra 1 we have the lists of the temple articles which were to be taken back to Jerusalem. We have the record of the names of the returned exiles in Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7. And it seems, reflecting back to what we said about Chronicles, this whole idea of establishing the continuity between the pre-exilic community in Judah and Jerusalem and this newly returned community after the 70 years of Babylonian exile. Both of them seem to want to make sure that the lists demonstrate that there is this continued concern of God for his people, and we see it also, of course, in the genealogies of Ezra 7. The distinct names that are given to the residents of Jerusalem. These are not just nobodies. Their names are important. They are families whose family trees can be traced right back to the pre-exilic community, and of course names of priests and Levites again. And so in addition to all of that, we also see that both of the books have a strong emphasis upon the use of letters, for example. And the letters, whether they be letters that were written by King Artaxerxes or others, but the content of those letters becomes a significant feature in both of the books. And indeed, so too do the royal edicts, such as the edicts given in the first instance, of course, by Cyrus, king of Persia. Another notable feature, though, is this curious shift between first and third person narrative, and we see it both in Ezra and in Nehemiah. On some occasions telling the story as if standing at a distance and rehearsing what has been happening, and on other occasions telling the story as if the narrator is right there in the midst of it, and themselves they are recording their own particular part in this whole story. But this shifting back and forth between first and first person narrative is a feature in both Ezra and Nehemiah, strengthening of course the case that it may well be the same author in cases. Well, let's have a look now particularly at the date and the context and an outline. As we've already indicated, there clearly seems to be three periods of return from Babylonian exile, just as there were three periods of movement into exile, of course with Daniel in 605, with Ezekiel in 597, and then the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem in 586. Now we have three waves, if you like, of returnees. And of course the first returnees come back in 538, when Cyrus, king of Persia, took over the Babylonian Empire. In 538, he immediately began to make it very clear that his intention was to develop a whole new policy about all of these exiles that had been brought into the kingdom. And his policy was to actually allow them to return to their own countries. And it seems to have been a very carefully considered policy. In fact, as we read of the edict or the decree of Cyrus in Ezra 1 verses 1 to 4, we find that the material there is almost entirely reflective of what's been discovered on what is known as the Cyrus cylinder. And the Cyrus cylinder, in fact, some of the wording or the translation of it can be found in your module learning guide. I encourage you to read that. But it indicates something of this policy to allow exiles to return to their home countries, not to break down the power of his empire, but in fact to strengthen it in its outlying regions. And so Cyrus allows the people of Judah to return to their own land and to begin to rebuild. Ezra 1 verse 1 also links so beautifully this post-exilic event to the earlier promise that was given by Jeremiah the prophet. He starts off in chapter 1 and verse 1, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. The Lord moved in the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia. And so what Ezra is doing here is making it very clear that what we see happening here now is actually both a fulfillment of the promise that God gave through Jeremiah, and it is God who is actually ultimately still in control. And there's a great message here for the returnee, that God is still in control. When it comes to the returnees, there has been considerable debate though over who was actually the leader of the returnees. In Ezra 1 and verse 8, we read that Cyrus, king of Persia, had gathered together all of the materials that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem, all of the treasures, and he entrusts them to Shashbazzar. And later we're told in chapter 5 that Cyrus also appoints this Shashbazzar as governor, and he is the one who lays the foundation of the temple. Now all of that sounds fine, excepting for the fact in chapter 3 verses 8 to 13, it seems as if it's saying that Zerubbabel is the one who is the governor, and certainly Zerubbabel is the one who lays the foundation. In fact, Haggai chapter 1 and verse 1 makes it very clear that Zerubbabel is the one who is the governor of Judah. And some have looked at these two different names and they said, well look, how can we trust this account? It seems to be inconsistent. One of the possibilities, of course, is that the name Shashbazzar was the governor, and this governorship was later inherited or transferred across to Zerubbabel. Or possibly a more likely scenario is that the name Shashbazzar was in fact a Persian name and his Hebrew name was Zerubbabel, and we've seen some of that sort of thing in the past along the way. But the use of these two different names, I think, ought not to greatly shake our confidence in the veracity of the record that we have. So who is the group that returns under Zerubbabel? Well, Ezra 2 lists approximately 50,000 returnees who come back. And like the temple treasures in Ezra 1, the genealogies of the returnees is used to strongly connect them to the Israel of the past, the people who lived in Israel before the exile ever took place. If we look then at what actually takes place throughout the record of Ezra, chapter 3, of course, they return, and the emphasis immediately is upon the building of an altar and the laying of the foundations of the temple. Worship practices were revived around what was essentially a very simple altar, much simpler than what had previously been there. But all of this seems to be in an act to recall Israel's first settlement when they came in to the promised land and established an altar to the Lord. Of course, it moves on then to the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. And the way in which this is described in Ezra 3 is so wonderfully reflective of the time of King Solomon. And not only that, of course, then there is the laying of the temple foundations, an occasion which is accompanied by a celebration of great joy amongst the people. They are finally back after 70 long years, and the temple is going to be rebuilt. And one almost gets a sense of the sense of excitement that finally now they are going to be back. But we move then very quickly into Ezra 4 and 5, and as quickly as the work has begun in the temple, we discover that the enemies of Judah have come, in one sense offering to help in the building of the temple, but Zerubbabel and Joshua refused to let them. And of course there's a lot of questions around why they have been refused. You will have certainly got one perspective in the video that you've just watched, that overview. But there may be another reason, and that is simply that these people who have come to help were in fact the predecessors of the Samaritans. They were people of a mixed ancestry. They were people who were of a mixed race now, partly Jewish but also partly from the earlier Syrian invasion of 722 BC. And because they were no longer true full-blood Jews, Zerubbabel and Joshua felt that they had no right, no part in this rebuilding exercise. And so in consequence they began to intimidate and discourage the Jews from progressing with the rebuilding of the temple. But then all of that moves us on then to the resumption of the building in chapter 6, around about 520 BC. Haggai and Zechariah emerge on the scene and in a sense urge the people to press on with the task of the rebuilding of the temple, not to be disheartened by the enemies who seem to have in one sense wanted to help initially but then backed away and become the great discouragers of the work. And even though the regional governor had made requests to Darius to have the work stopped, and of course we see this in chapter 5, that they're wanting to write to Darius to persuade him that what these Jews are doing now is a subversive, undermining thing. Even though they've written and asked for him to order the work to be stopped, the request is actually met in entirely the opposite way, as Darius writes then, and he gives his heartfelt support to the work that these Jews have put their hand to. In fact, he gives them every legitimacy for continuing on with the rebuilding work. And so, of course, the temple is completed. Ezra 6 and verse 15, completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius, 70 years after its destruction. Finally, the temple is rebuilt. Now, Of course, there is a sense of lamentation amongst some of the older generations who remember the early days, the good old days, and this new temple is not a patch on the old temple that was there. But nonetheless, the Passover which followed was reminiscent. It was reminiscent of the revivals of Hezekiah and Josiah's time, and in one sense completes Judah's second Exodus deliverance. The first Exodus, of course, out of Egypt. This Exodus now out of Babylon. But there is another return under Ezra that we read about in chapter 4. And here it suggests that the local opposition continues to characterize the returnees as their attention is now turned toward the rebuilding of the wall. In 465, Artaxerxes seized the throne of the Persian Empire following the assassination of his father Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as his name is given to us in the book of Esther. In Ezra 7, around about 459 BC, Ezra comes with Artaxerxes' commissioning letter, and here again we have another of these recorded letters for us. And in this letter, he not only permits Israel and the priests and the Levites to accompany Ezra, but he actually commissions him to take all of the required resources that he needs from Babylon. He authorizes that support and tax exemption from the local authorities be given to them so that they can actually get on and do the work. And he not only does that, but he authorizes Ezra to teach and enforce the law of Judah. And so in many ways, Ezra chapter 7 becomes an exciting chapter to see that God is still in control, even when it seems that the enemies of these returnees is determined to see them brought undone. And then, of course, in Ezra chapter 8, we have the journey to Judah. And before departing, with around about 5,000 exiles, Ezra discovers that they had no Levites present. So he recruits some who would be consecrated, set aside to carry the temple items and carry out the temple service once they actually get to Jerusalem. And so upon their arrival, there is a sacrifice and again a great celebration. And it seems that there's numbers of these times along the journey through Ezra and Nehemiah where there are periods of great celebration, and all of these hark back to those earlier days of celebration that happened long before the exile. But there are obstacles to Ezra's reform. One of these is the people's intermarriage. Ezra is distressed over the people's intermarriage with pagan neighbours, and it's expressed in his penitential prayer. You might compare Nehemiah 9 and Daniel 9, where in a sense he identifies with the sinfulness of his own people, and he laments the possibility that Judah might, by her actions, actually lose God's mercy just at a time when hope was finally being renewed after all of the years of punishment in exile. And so we move on then to look further at the reforms of Ezra that are brought up for us in Nehemiah 8 to 10. Ezra is seen as overseeing these religious reforms by engaging in the public reading of the law with the people, by the revival of the Feast of Tabernacles, which seems to have fallen, beg your pardon, into disinterest amongst the people. The collection of a collective prayer, rather, of repentance on behalf of the people, which is so typical of some of God's great servants of old, who will pray these great penitential prayers on behalf of the people. The formal renewal of the covenant, as we read in chapter 9 and through into chapter 10 as well. But in all of these issues, there are similar things that are being addressed by both Ezra and Nehemiah, and one is this intermarriage with pagan neighbours. Remember, right back when they first returned, they wouldn't let the people, their surrounding neighbours, share with them in the work of the rebuilding of the temple, because they were not, they had not been kept set apart for God, and yet now they themselves are engaging in this same practice of marrying into the pagan peoples that surround them. Not only that, there's a concern about the Sabbath observance, which they seem to be neglecting, the whole issue of debt and forgiveness, which is so deeply embedded in the just heart of God and reflected in God's covenant with the people. Their maintenance of temple worship. Now the temple has been rebuilt, and all of that excitement that was there suddenly seems to have been dissipated. And now the temple is almost left neglect. Which brings us then to Nehemiah and the return that comes with Nehemiah. We read about this in Nehemiah chapter 1, the start of it. And here we read of the authorization that Nehemiah is given. Nehemiah, of course, was in the Persian court. He was a Persian official and sought permission from Artaxerxes to return to Jerusalem after hearing that of the ruined conditions of the city walls. Yes, the temple has been rebuilt, but the walls still lie in ruins. And so Artaxerxes, perhaps interested in securing the area, grants Nehemiah permission to return and to rebuild the walls. And so the commencement of the construction takes place in chapter 2 and runs on into chapter 3 of Nehemiah. And it starts that when Nehemiah gets there after a secret survey of the state of the walls, Nehemiah secures the cooperation of Judah's leadership to begin the reconstruction work. He goes on a nighttime reconnaissance to see what is the state of the walls, and then he gets the people around him. He says, now come on guys, we've got to get in, we've got to get this work done. And so in chapter 3 describes the individuals who put up their hands and said, yes, we'll participate, showing in one sense that overall it was the work of all the people, both great and small. This became a unified effort that we've got to get the walls of the city built. And so as we move then on further, we find that just as there was opposition to the building of the temple, so now they would receive opposition from a number of quarters to the rebuilding of the walls. And so we have external opposition from a fellow by the name of Sanballat, governor of Samaria, which is just to the north. And of course the Samaritans were this interbred group between the northern kingdom of Israel and the Assyrians. And so Sanballat comes and he attacks them in one sense from the north. And then from the south you've got Gershom the Arab, who comes seeking to dissuade and discourage them. From the east you've got Tobiah and the Ammonites, who try to dissuade them. And so we're not the least bit surprised then to discover that from the west you've got the Philistines of Ashdod, who also join in this effort to discourage the people from the rebuilding of the walls. And yet I love Nehemiah. Nehemiah's solution is the first thing that he does is pray. I love the heart of Nehemiah as we read through his story, that for Nehemiah, for him, prayer was always the first response, not the last resort. So often for many of us, we do all that we possibly can. We try to maneuver the pieces. We try to sort it out, find a solution. And finally, our last resort is we decide we've just got to turn to God in prayer. And yet for Nehemiah, it is clearly always his very first response. Not only that, but he's very practical. He posts a guard and he reorganises the workers. Half of them are to work and half of them to keep guard. And each worker is to carry his weapon on his side. But he reminds the people of God's awesome power, that God is the one who's been with them in the past. He'll be with them again into the future. They are not to lose. And so, of course, upon the completion of the walls, which are completed in just 52 days, an extraordinary effort by anyone's imagination, there is yet again a coming back to this great joy and celebration. And Nehemiah then took the measures to make sure that the city was guarded and improve the security by legislating for its repopulation. One of the things we discover early in the piece is that having rebuilt the walls, there's not many people living in Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah undertakes to make sure that people move back in and take up residence inside the city. I wonder though if you could stop for a moment and just think as to why it might be that it was so difficult to persuade people, these returned exiles, to actually live in Jerusalem. It's a question worth reflecting on, let me suggest. But then it seems that Nehemiah actually has to move away for a period of time, and we're not really sure as to what is behind all of this, excepting for the fact that we read in Nehemiah 13 that he goes away. Nehemiah 13 verse 6, "But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I returned to the king." And so he's gone back to Babylon for a period of time. But when he returns, Nehemiah encounters the same recurrent problems that Ezra had encountered upon his return, right back in 433 BC. And what we see there is a loss of concern amongst the people for temple holiness and the maintenance of the temple service and worship. We see this disregard for the Sabbath regulations, all for the sake of commerce, making a buck, so to speak. But the other issue which re-emerges yet again is this intermarriage outside the race and outside of the faith. And of course, going right back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, God had warned them of the dangers of intermarrying with the other peoples around about them who would draw their hearts away from God. So finally, some of the major theological themes. The restoration of Israel from exile was all of God's doing. That's one of the great themes in it, that a reminder that God has been sovereignly in control. The restoration of the covenant was complete, even though politically independence was not attained. Here we see a shift from the focus on the leaders to the actual community itself. In one sense, the covenant was not dependent upon the leaders, but upon the people. And then, of course, just as God had used the world powers to judge his people, so he could use them just as effectively to restore his people to the land. God is able to do that. And his people should take great heart in this. And even though Israel's restoration evoked fierce opposition, that opposition was thwarted at every turn, and it was God who was in control. And finally, the restored community was in many ways a chastened people. And yet, even for all of that, they also needed frequent rebuke and reformation. A chastened people, but a people who seemed to be so hard of learning. Israel remained a wayward people. They still awaited the new covenant of which Jeremiah had spoken in chapter 31. That renewal to be effected by God's Spirit, as announced by Joel and Ezekiel, that which would change them from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh. In one sense, a kind of sad ending, but a reminder nonetheless that God is not giving up on his people. And we can praise God that he has not given up. And we today have been the blessed recipients of God's determination to fulfill all of his good purposes through the nation of Israel, and ultimately through the sending of his Son, the Lord Jesus, the greater David, whose death, whose life would be able to give to us not only the forgiveness of sins, but the renewal of our hearts, a heart that would be born again by the Spirit of God.